like puts people in chemical comas for months on end. And while they're in these chemical comas, he would put an audio device next to their pillow playing these psychic driving messages. And he would put them in sensory deprivation chambers for weeks. You know, they would have goggles over their eyes, earmuffs on their ears. They would have cardboard tubes over their arms so that they couldn't feel anything. And they would just be in a room for weeks on end. The idea, again, being to induce enough stress so that it breaks them down. Electric shock. So that's one of the things, too. We would put these electrodes on the heads of people, and he would continually shock them until, again, the idea was to reduce them to, like, in one case, he says, an infantile-like state where they lose control of their bladder, they can't eat, they can't talk, they can't go to the bathroom on their own, they can't put on their own clothes or anything like that. You know, therapy sessions or whatever they would call it, but just basically torture to these people. For the most part, the people who he did his practice on came out way worse than when they went in. He's doing this on his own because he thinks he's going to cure mental illness by having this radical breakthrough where we break them down and build them back up, and we can build them back up and make them forget their schizophrenia or depression or whatever they have. The CIA reads his article about psychic driving, and they think this is the kind of thing we're interested in. So from that point on, they start funding him. Mary Morrow, who is one of the patients of Ewen Cameron in Montreal. She had been training to be a doctor under him, and she had administered some of these techniques. She ended up having almost kind of a psychotic break herself. She became anorexic, and she failed her neurology exams, and so she went into a really deep depression. She attempted to commit suicide. That didn't work. She was admitted to the hospital, to another hospital. Ewen Cameron came to visit her, and he said, I think you should come back to the Allen Memorial, not as a doctor, but as a patient, and let me treat you. So she ends up going back to the Allen Memorial as a patient. She thought to herself that it's going to be okay, they're not going to do the electric shock to me because you had to sign a consent form and, you know, for that to happen to you. But she knows, I haven't signed a consent form, so they can't do that to me. But it turns out in the time since she went to the hospital and came back, they had stopped doing the consent forms, and he would just do this on whoever. She would call her mother after some of these treatments, and her mother knew something was going on because she just became more and more incoherent as time went on. So the mother sent Mary's sister, Margaret, in order to go to the Allen Memorial to basically bust her out of there. So eventually she goes to her sister's room, opens the door, and Mary is sitting there just with wide bug eyes, you know, doesn't even recognize her sister. It takes several days for her to figure out where she actually is, and then she gets busted out of there. She went on to have a little bit of a career, but she eventually attempted to commit suicide later again. That was unsuccessful. And then her and several of the victims of Ewen Cameron's experiments in the 1980s, they ended up suing the CIA for supporting Ewen Cameron.
So what was the result of the trial?
Oh, well, so it was actually settled out of court before it went to trial. So the plaintiffs, the CIA gave the plaintiffs $750,000 to be split among them. But, after attorney's fees and everything, it doesn't really amount to much anyway. And so...
Wow.